Welcome back. And now in this new session, we turn to chapter 20 of your Harris-Platzner textbook, and we get to introduce you to your second Roman author. And as it turns out, also the final author for CLA 395, Greek Myth, Gods, Heroes, and Humans. It's been quite a long journey through this course. I hope it's been a really valuable and pleasant one for you, and we're now finally going to be able to turn to our last author. You should also understand that these final four chapters of Harris-Platzner, chapters 18, 19, 20, 21, really do represent the transition of Greek mythology from its original source in Greece. This basically goes in two phases. One is the Roman phase, chapters 18, 19, and 20, where the Romans get hold of Greek mythology and keep it mostly the same, but modify it in places in order to give it its appropriate Roman character. And then second is post-Roman, what happens in literature written after Roman times, all the way down to modern times, how we see examples of Greek mythology in art, literature, and music and such in many centuries well after the Greek world and even after the Roman world. So we'll get to chapter 21 in the next session, but for right now we're going to spend our time introducing this final author, Ovid, and his great grand work, The Metamorphoses. And again, you can see his Roman name, Publius Ovidius Naso, but again, we know him as Ovid. I have three things to ask you to do now to pause the video. First of all, in your Harris-Platzner textbook, please turn to page 932, which is the beginning of Metamorphoses in Harris-Platzner. Second, please, on Sakai, go to your calendar and open the session for chapter 20 and Ovid, because there is the outline there again that will pertain to Ovid and also to the Roman Empire that I'm going to discuss in the video after the Metamorphoses video. And then finally, please go to Resources on Sakai and open handout number 5. That's the one about Ovid. So please, again, pause your video, get out handout number 5, the calendar entry on Ovid and the Roman Empire, and page 932 in your Harris-Platzner textbook. Please pause your video and do those three things. Okay, are you all set? Is everything in place? Excellent. So we're going to begin with the bio of our author, Ovid. Look at what we have here. Zeus's lightning bolt. This hasn't shown up for quite a while, but it has reappeared here. Why would you guess that it's reappeared? Because of this. So Zeus's lightning bolt here is introducing the fact that something very unfortunate happened to our poor author Ovid. He, I'm sorry to say, had a bad time, especially when you compare him with his colleague Virgil. So okay, let's go to the first page of the handout so we can learn exactly what did happen to him. So just like Virgil, Ovid was born in the north part of Italy. In this case, to the son of an equestrian family. Just like Virgil, Ovid traveled to Rome to get his education. Just like Virgil, Ovid was a really good student and learned all about Greek literature and other aspects of Greek education, and traveled over there in order to continue with that. Just like Virgil, Ovid did not do too much in politics and spent most of his time working with literature. And just like Virgil, Ovid had a patron of the arts under Emperor Augustus. It was Messala this time instead of Maecenas. But oops, G, row number 1 of your handout. Suddenly things changed drastically. Something went wrong with Ovid, and we're not exactly sure what it was. But rumor got around that Ovid was one of numerous men who came to know Augustus's daughter, Julia. Augustus, the emperor, was a real prude, we have to say, very, very bluntly. He had his hand in the passing of a great deal of legislation, essentially bypassing the Senate for that purpose. And among the legislation was a great deal of moralistic legislation, and Augustus was no more successful really with his moralistic legislation than any other period in history. And in particular, this included his adultery law. Adultery was to be punished by exile. And as it turns out, Augustus's daughter Julia, Augustus's own blood son or daughter, was the one who was responsible for producing an heir for Augustus to carry on the empire with a successor for him, since he did not have any natural-born son. While she appears not to have taken well that particular responsibility. And although she was married several times, she also had apparently quite a few men in her life. And eventually, when Augustus found out about it, he punished the various men and also did, in fact, exile his daughter Julia. And there were several later relatives in the Julio-Claudian family who were similarly punished because of adultery. One of them was Livilla, that was the sister of the later emperor Claudius. Okay, so apparently Ovid was one of these men. And if that's the case, that could explain why he was eventually sent out into exile, although we can't exactly be sure. There's also an indication that Ovid may have written a piece of literature that may have been offensive to Augustus, and that maybe that led to the exile. We really don't know. But he did end up in exile, and he never returned to Rome, despite literature that he wrote and repeated letters to his family and to Augustus trying to get a remission. He just never got it. So he ended up dying in exile. He was basically on the Crimea Peninsula, which was a much colder and snowier area to live, and where people didn't know Latin, so he had nobody to talk to. And so eventually he just died out in exile in very bad shape at a city called Tomis, Tomis, in AD 17. So prior to Ovid's arrival in exile, he did continue to compose some works of literature, the Epistulae and the Tristii. So therefore, he did not cease publication. But obviously, everything had changed for him in a really drastic way once he ended up out there. Okay, so most of the rest of the handout discusses his extant works, which are quite extensive. And I will note that all of these works are elegiac. Now, elegiac was a meter that is somewhat similar to the epic meter, except for one change that happens every other line. So remember that the epic meter goes like this. There are 6 beats altogether. Now, the elegiac meter does this. Every second line, it goes bum, 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 and stops. Bum, 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 bum. So that meter was used frequently by the Greeks, especially in the 5th century BC, for epitaphs that were inscribed on stones. And so elegiac was originally the meter used for poetry of honor or tribute for somebody who had fallen. But in time, elegiac meter, especially in the Hellenistic period, took on a life of its own apart from that, and it became a common and very popular meter for a poetry. It, of course, was notorious for its use as love poetry, which is what we see a great deal with Ovid and his 2 colleagues, Propertius and Tibullus. But it was not necessarily specifically meant for love poetry. It could in fact be used for any subject. It was just that love poetry is the one that the Romans became especially proficient in writing in elegiac meter. Okay, so elegiac works prior to Metamorphoses. Page 1 of your handout is Amores, which is a work describing the misadventure of the poet in love. What that's describing is the way that a poet is supposed to write poetry in which he laments how he's in love and the love of his life is ignoring him. This was a common trope that developed especially in Hellenistic poetry, in which you have the poet who is unable to get to the woman that he really falls in love with. If you kind of think of the Billy Joel song Uptown Girl, it's a little bit like that. She's out of his league. She's socially way above him. She's wealthy and he's poor. The door is shut on him and he's sitting at the door crying his heart out and all that kind of stuff. So that was the common trope that developed. And so what Ovid basically is describing is, suppose you're the poet in love, what do you do? Well, how do you compose the poetry? What other kind of stuff do you do? And so that's what this work of Amores is describing. So one of the tendencies that developed a lot with Hellenistic literature was the study of the genres themselves. How do you write examples of that genre? So in that sense, Hellenistic poetry got the reputation of being somewhat artificial because it tended to be literary types of writing in order to explore how you do the writing, as opposed to spontaneous piece of literature that might have been brought about by a specific event or a specific inspiration by a particular poet at a particular time. So that does change the nature of literature quite a bit, and it's that particular studiousness with literature that the Romans especially tap into as they compose their own literature. So that's what Ovid shows here with Hellenistic influence, is how do you go about composing poetry in this particular mode of being the poet desperately in love and being ignored. Okay, so that's a mores. Then from there, in the next page, you pass to Heroides that we study in, shameless plug, 396, the Myths of Rome. Heroides are poems written by women to all the various men who mistreat them in mythology. So Ariadne writes to Theseus, Medea writes to Jason, Penelope writes to Odysseus, and oh yes, Dido writes to Aeneas. So you get to see all of that played out in the Heroides, what the women think of those men who have been so cruel to them in one way or another. So that's a really fun work. It's really quite remarkable to see a Roman male author giving the women point of view so much breadth, as Ovid does uniquely in the work Heroides. And as I say, we do study that work in 396, Myths of Rome. Moving along quickly to the next page, there's the work Ars Amatoria, which is now another didactic work by Ovid. What he's now describing is, how do you commit adultery? First two books, how does a man get to the woman, a married woman? And in the third book, how does a woman get to a married man? It might be that this is the work that could have cost Ovid his Roman citizenship, because this was just exactly the kind of rather quasi-satiric work that might have gone against the grain with Augustus and his moralizing legislation, especially regarding adultery. So maybe this did it, although it is a little strange that it took 8 years for Augustus to figure out that he didn't like this work so much that he wanted to see that its author put out in exile. So it's not really plausible that this is the only cause, but it probably did have a contributing effect toward Ovid's exile. All right, Metamorphoses, the big thing, an F on page 3 of your handout. That's the big epic work in which Ovid now compiles a whole group of myths from the Greek world and from other worlds. And what he's composing is a long description of the creation of the world, very much similar to Hesiod's creation, and we'll talk about that in the next video on Metamorphoses. From creation all the way through the evolution of the human condition, with all sorts of transformations happening on the way into birds and animals and plants and rocks and so forth, and then the growth of the Roman world, Trojan War, Aeneas' journey, the kingship period, the Republic period, Julius Caesar, his death, and finally the advent of Augustus and the Roman Empire. All of that is discussed in Metamorphoses. So I'll give a short video on that afterwards. Moving along in the handout, you have Ovid's work called the Fasti, which was meant to be a 12-book calendar in which each day of the year would have a specific poem associated with all of its various pieces of mythology. And unfortunately, Ovid got through only 6 books of it, down to June before he was sent into exile. So sadly, we only have January through June, and the rest of it was never finished. Then, while Ovid was out in exile, he did write the Tristia, where he was lamenting how awful it was to live out in the Black Sea. And there are the Epistulae ex Ponto, where Ovid wrote a whole series of poetic letters to his wife and other people, trying to get himself recalled from exile. And so far as we can tell, this is the last genuine work that Ovid wrote. There is this work called the Ibis, which is an elegiac invective poem, one attacking various personages, but it's not necessarily thought to perhaps to be Ovid's. It might be a spurious work. And we are aware that Ovid did compose one tragedy, a go-around with Medea, and of course Ovid does include Medea quite prominently in Metamorphoses, but we do not actually have this particular tragedy surviving. Ovid is probably, without question, one of the most successful and influential poets we have from Roman literature, in some ways surpassing even Virgil. And it's really regrettable that Ovid himself suffered so severely in the last decade of his life, because his literature really did surpass. Once again, there are many, many, many influences. I just mentioned a few on the handout, like Dryden, Shakespeare, Pope, Chaucer, and so forth. And there are numerous works of art as well. I do recommend that you go back to your syllabus and find that first website on the syllabus that takes you to University of Vermont. This is the composition that was done by my professor at University of Vermont, Philip Ambrose, of works of art that relate closely to scenes in Ovid's Metamorphoses. You could just go through that and you could see how diverse and extensive the artistic tradition is that grew up out of the stories that were preserved for us very successfully in Ovid's Metamorphoses. So speaking of which, let's turn now in our next video to this great work.